The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1914, and with it came a promise that would haunt Thomas Clarke for the rest of his days. "Home by Christmas," the recruiting officer had said, his voice booming across the town square in Manchester. "The Kaiser won't last 3 months against the might of the British Empire." Thomas was 19 years old, with calloused hands from working at his father's textile mill and dreams bigger than the smoke-stained streets of his childhood. When he clutched that piece of paper confirming his enlistment in the 16th Battalion of the Manchester Regiment, he felt invincible. His mother cried into her apron. His father shook his hand with a grip that trembled. His younger sister Margaret, only 8 years old, asked if he would bring her back a souvenir from France. He promised her a button from a German uniform. He promised he would be back before the snow fell. He promised so many things that autumn morning, standing in their cramped kitchen with sunlight streaming through the illuminating the dust motes that danced between them like tiny spirits bearing witness to oaths that would shatter like glass. But here is what Thomas Clarke did not know as he boarded the train at Manchester Victoria Station on October 3, 1914, waving to the crowd of well-wishers until they became nothing more than colorful specks in the distance. The war would not end by Christmas. It would not end the following Christmas, nor the one after that. The promise was a lie, though no one knew it yet. The promise was a beautiful, terrible lie that would consume 4 years, 9 million lives, and every assumption humanity held about the nature of modern warfare. Thomas Clarke would indeed return home. But the man who came back would bear little resemblance to the boy who left. And Margaret would wait for that button for 73 years. The crossing to France was rough. Men vomited over the rails of the transport ship, their faces green in the dim light. Thomas stood on deck, feeling the spray of the channel against his face, tasting salt and something else he could not name. Perhaps it was the metallic tang of fear, or maybe just the coal smoke from the ship's engines. Around him, soldiers sang songs. "It's a long way to Tipperary," echoed across the water, voices young and unbroken by what was to come. Lieutenant Geoffrey Hartwell, a Cambridge graduate with wire-rimmed spectacles and a habit of quoting Tennyson, stood beside Thomas at the rail. "Do you think it will really be over quickly?" Thomas asked him. Hartwell adjusted his spectacles and stared out at the dark water. "My classics professor said all wars are quick in the planning and eternal in the suffering," he replied. "But what do academics know of real life?" He laughed then, a sound that would haunt Thomas in the years to come, because it was the last genuine laugh he would hear from Geoffrey Hartwell's lips. They arrived in France on October 7th, disembarking at Boulogne into a world that seemed deceptively normal. French children sold postcards to the soldiers. A woman with a cart offered fresh bread that smelled like heaven after the ship's rations. The countryside rolled green and golden in the autumn light, peaceful as a painting. The men joked and laughed, shouldering their packs with confidence. They marched inland, boots crunching on roads that had witnessed centuries of history, passing villages with names Thomas could not pronounce. Old men watched them from doorways. Women hung laundry that flapped like white flags in the breeze. Thomas wrote a letter to Margaret that night, sitting by candlelight in a barn where they had bivouacked. "France is beautiful," he wrote in his careful script. "The people are kind. We will push the Germans back to Berlin, and I will be home to help you build a snowman in the garden. Keep my spot warm by the fire." He sealed the letter with wax, pressed his thumb into it, and handed it to the postal corporal. That letter reached Manchester 3 weeks later. By then, Thomas Clarke had already seen things that would make snowmen and fireplaces seem like memories from someone else's life. The first time Thomas heard the guns, he thought it was thunder. They were marching through a forest near Ypres in Belgium, where the British Expeditionary Force was establishing defensive positions. The sound rolled across the landscape like a living thing, deep and resonant, making the ground tremble beneath their feet. "That's artillery," Sergeant William Preston said, his Yorkshire accent cutting through the nervous murmurs of the men. Preston was 35, a career soldier with scars on his knuckles and a way of speaking that made even bad news sound matter of fact. "Jerry's about 10 miles ahead. We'll be in position by nightfall." The forest smelled of pine and damp earth. Somewhere a bird was singing, oblivious to the mechanical thunder in the distance. Thomas tried to match the sound to something in his experience, the machines at the mill perhaps, or the quarry explosions in the hills outside Manchester. But this was different. This was the sound of the 20th century announcing itself, the sound of promises breaking. They reached the front line on October 23, 1914, and Thomas Clarke discovered that hell was not fire and brimstone as the Sunday school teachers had described, but rather mud and wire, and the constant possibility of sudden erasure. The trenches near Ypres were not yet the elaborate systems they would become. These were hasty scrapes in the Belgian soil, barely deep enough to stand in, with no duckboards or drainage. Water pooled at the bottom, cold and filthy. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of unwashed bodies, latrine pits, decaying sandbags, and something sweet and rotten that Thomas would later recognize as death itself, waiting patiently just beyond the parapet. His section was assigned to a stretch of line opposite the village of Passchendaele. Though in October 1914, that name meant nothing special yet. It would take 3 more years for Passchendaele to become synonymous with the ultimate futility of war. Lieutenant Hartwell organized them with the efficiency of a man arranging books on a shelf. Sentries posted, fire steps established, ammunition distributed. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying the studied calmness of officer training, "we hold this line until reinforcements arrive. Command estimates 3 weeks, perhaps a month, before we have the strength to push forward. Then it's on to Berlin." The men nodded, believing. Thomas checked his rifle for the 100th time, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The Lee Enfield was a beautiful piece of machinery, precise and deadly. He had scored well in marksmanship training. Somehow, he had imagined war would involve using that skill. Clean shots at distant targets, soldiers falling like the paper silhouettes on the range. He had not imagined this. The waiting, the cold seeping through his uniform, the way fear tasted like copper on his tongue. The German attack came on the morning of October 29th. Thomas was on sentry duty, staring across no man's land through the pre-dawn darkness when he saw them. Shadows moving through the mist, hundreds of them, advancing in waves across the torn earth. For a moment, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It seemed impossible that so many men could materialize out of nothing. Then Sergeant Preston was shouting, "Stand to! Stand to!" And the trench exploded into chaos. Men scrambled to their positions, rifles at the ready. The German artillery opened up first, shells screaming overhead, landing behind the British line with earth-shaking explosions. Thomas pressed himself against the front wall of the trench, feeling each impact in his bones. Dirt rained down on them. Someone was praying in a desperate whisper. Someone else was crying. Then the order came. "Rapid fire!" Thomas raised his rifle above the parapet and fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. He worked the bolt, fired again. Around him, the air filled with the crack of rifles, the chatter of a machine gun somewhere to his left. The attacking Germans were closer now, running through their own artillery barrage in a display of either courage or madness. Thomas could see their faces, young like his, twisted with fear and determination. He fired until his shoulder ached, until his ears rang with a high-pitched whine that would never completely fade. Men fell in no man's land, crumpling like puppets with cut strings. But they kept coming, wave after wave. The British machine gun traversed back and forth, cutting them down methodically. It was not heroic. It was not glorious. It was industrial slaughter. And Thomas felt something break inside him as he participated in it. The attack lasted 3 hours. When it was over, no man's land was carpeted with German dead and wounded. The cries of the injured carried across the torn earth, calls for help in a language Thomas did not understand, but whose meaning was universal. Some of the cries were in English too. British soldiers hit during the barrage. Lieutenant Hartwell organized stretcher parties to bring in their own wounded during a brief, unofficial ceasefire. Thomas helped carry Private James Whitmore, a cheerful Londoner who had shared his cigarettes the night before. Whitmore had been hit in the stomach, and his hands pressed against the wound, trying to hold himself together. "Am I going to die, Tommy?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. "No, mate, you're going home," Thomas lied. "Lucky bastard you are." Whitmore died before they reached the aid station. His last breath a wet rattle that Thomas would hear in his sleep for decades. That night, as Thomas sat in the trench cleaning his rifle with shaking hands, Sergeant Preston handed him a tin of stew and a cup of rum. "First time is always hardest," Preston said, settling down beside him. "Doesn't get easier, mind you, but you get used to it." Thomas looked at him, this career soldier with his matter-of-fact acceptance of horror. "How long do you think it will last, Sergeant?" he asked. Preston lit a cigarette, the match flare illuminating his weathered face. "The war, or your ability to care?" He took a long drag, exhaled slowly. "Both longer than you want, lad. Both longer than you want." In that moment, sitting in the mud with the smell of cordite and death all around them, Thomas Clarke began to understand that the promise of a quick war was not just optimistic, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of what this conflict would become. The weeks turned into months. Christmas 1914 came and went. There was the famous informal truce on some parts of the line, where British and German soldiers met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, played football. In Thomas's sector, they simply stopped shooting for a day. He wrote to Margaret, telling her he would be home soon, knowing it was a lie but unable to write the truth. How could he explain this to an 8-year-old? How could he describe the way men rotted in the wire, the way rats grew fat on corpses, the way his dreams had become an endless loop of screaming and mud? He could not send that letter home to the neat terraced house in Manchester, so he wrote about the French countryside, about the kindness of village families behind the lines, about how much he missed her. He did not write about how he had stopped feeling entirely, how he moved through each day like an automaton, his humanity packed away somewhere safe where the war could not reach it. The war did not end in 1915. It did not end in 1916. Each year, the generals promised breakthrough. Each year, the lists of dead grew longer. Thomas Clarke survived the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, where the Germans first used chlorine gas and men drowned in their own lungs, frothing and choking. He survived because the wind shifted at the crucial moment, blowing the yellow-green cloud away from his section. Lieutenant Hartwell was not so fortunate. Thomas found him after the gas attack, lying in the trench with his face purple, his Cambridge education and Tennyson quotes extinguished in less than 5 minutes of chemical agony. Thomas held his hand as he died, feeling the frantic grip weaken and finally release. He searched Hartwell's pockets afterward, per protocol, and found a letter to the lieutenant's mother, unsent, describing the beauty of a sunset he had witnessed the week before. Thomas added it to the pile of effects destined for next of kin, another footnote in the great catalogue of loss. By the summer of 1916, Thomas had been promoted to corporal, not because of any particular heroism, but simply because he was alive and had all his limbs. The attrition rate of junior leaders was staggering. Sergeant Preston had been evacuated in March with trench foot so severe they had to amputate 3 toes. His replacement was a boy of 18 named Collins, who lasted 6 days before a sniper shot took him through the throat. Command kept sending replacements, fresh-faced boys who arrived at the front with clean uniforms and belief in their eyes. Thomas was 21 years old and felt ancient. He had learned to sleep standing up in the trenches. He had learned to eat mechanically, tasting nothing, because the body needed fuel even when the soul had given up. He had learned to write cheerful letters home while sitting within a few hundred yards of literally thousands of decomposing human beings. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1st, 1916, and it was here that Thomas Clarke lost the last vestiges of the boy from Manchester who had believed in quick victories. The 16th Battalion was in the second wave of the attack on Fricourt. The British artillery had been bombarding the German lines for a week, and command assured them that nothing could survive such a barrage. The plan was simple: walk across no man's land, occupy the destroyed German trenches, push forward to victory. Thomas knew it was nonsense. He had seen too many failed attacks, too many confident plans shattered by the reality of machine guns and uncut wire. But orders were orders. At 7:45 a.m., they went over the top. The German defenses were not destroyed. The wire was not cut. The machine guns had survived in their deep bunkers, and when the British soldiers emerged from their trenches, walking in neat lines as instructed, the Germans opened fire. Thomas watched the first wave mowed down before they had covered 50 yards. Bodies fell in rows, as if choreographed. The sound was unimaginable. Thousands of rifles and dozens of machine guns creating a continuous roar that made thought impossible. Thomas ran forward because stopping meant dying where you stood. Men fell around him like rain. He jumped into a shell hole, pressed himself into the mud, and waited for death. It did not come. Hours passed. The sun beat down mercilessly. Wounded men cried for water, for their mothers, for God. Some of those cries lasted minutes. Some lasted all day, weakening gradually until they stopped. Thomas counted 17 men in his immediate vicinity who had been alive that morning. By nightfall, he was the only one still breathing. He crawled back to British lines after dark, covered in the blood of men whose names he had known. The battalion had taken 67% casualties in less than 12 hours. For this sacrifice, they had gained approximately 200 yards of destroyed earth. A staff officer came around to the survivors, clipboard in hand, asking for reports. Thomas stared at him, this clean man with his pressed uniform and his forms to fill out, and felt a hatred so pure it was almost religious. "Where's your commanding officer?" the staff officer asked. "Dead," Thomas replied. "Your sergeant?" "Dead." "Who's in command of this section?" Thomas looked around at the handful of survivors, most sitting in stunned silence, some crying openly. "I suppose I am, sir." The staff officer made a note on his clipboard. "Corporal Clarke, your section will be in reserve tomorrow. The attack continues at dawn." He walked away, already focused on his next task. Thomas sat down heavily and laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. The Somme offensive continued until November, achieving minimal gains at catastrophic cost. The 16th Battalion was rebuilt 3 times, absorbing replacements who arrived, died, and were replaced by new men who knew even less than their predecessors. Thomas was promoted to sergeant in August, given a stripe and responsibility for boys who looked to him for leadership he no longer possessed. He kept them alive when he could, which was not often. He wrote their final letters when he could not. His own letters to Margaret became shorter, more generic. "I am well. The weather is fine. I hope you are studying hard in school. Your loving brother, Thomas." She was 10 now, growing up without him. She sent him drawings, stick figures of soldiers, flowers, a house with smoke coming from the chimney. He kept them folded in his breast pocket next to his heart, a talisman against the dark. In 1917, the war entered its 4th year. 4 years of promises that it would end soon. 4 years of new strategies, new offensives, new ways to feed men into the meat grinder and gain nothing. Thomas Clarke turned 22 in March, and he could no longer remember what peace felt like. The war was the only reality. Everything else, Manchester, his family's house, his father's mill, Margaret's laughter, all of that existed in some distant, probably imaginary place. This was real. The mud, the lice, the rats, the constant percussion of artillery, the lottery of survival. He had stopped counting the dead. He had stopped learning the names of new replacements. What was the point? They would be gone soon enough. Better to keep them anonymous, to not have more ghosts calling his name in dreams. The Third Battle of Ypres, later known as Passchendaele, began on July 31st, 1917, and it was here, in the same region where Thomas had first entered the line nearly 3 years earlier, that he finally broke. The rains came early that year, turning the battlefield into an apocalyptic swamp. The British artillery, millions of shells over weeks of bombardment, destroyed the drainage systems that had kept the low-lying Belgian fields passable. What resulted was not mud as civilians understood it. This was a liquid earth, a soup of clay and water and chemicals and human remains that could swallow a man whole. Thomas saw it happen. Private Edwards from Cardiff, 19 years old, slipped off the duckboard during a relief march and sank into the mud up to his chest. They tried to pull him out, 5 men straining at ropes, but the mud held him like a vice. The Germans began shelling, and they had to abandon the rescue. Edwards was still screaming when they moved on, begging them not to leave him. His cries followed them for a quarter mile before fading into the general chorus of suffering. Thomas's platoon was ordered to take a fortified position called Beck House on October 9th, 1917. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. They advanced through the swamp in the pre-dawn darkness, each step a struggle against the sucking mud. German machine guns opened up from concealed positions, and men died screaming, falling into water-filled shell holes and drowning before they could be reached. Thomas led his section forward because that was what sergeants did, because stopping was not an option, because 3 years of war had programmed him to obey orders even when those orders were homicidal. They reached a line of shell holes 50 yards from Beck House and could advance no further. The German fire was too heavy. They spent 18 hours in those holes, in water up to their waists, unable to move forward or back, being slowly picked off by snipers and periodic artillery strikes. Night fell, and with it came the cold. Men developed hypothermia in the water. One soldier, Thompson, started talking to his dead mother, having conversations with empty air. Another, Wilson, simply stopped responding to commands, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. When the order finally came to withdraw, only 7 of Thomas's platoon of 35 men could walk back. The others were dead, wounded beyond mobility, or had simply disappeared into the mud. Thomas moved mechanically, one foot after another, his mind somewhere else entirely. They had gained nothing. Beck House remained in German hands. The attack was classified as unsuccessful in the official report, a polite word for mass casualty event. 3 days later, Thomas was in a support trench when a shell landed close enough to bury him in debris. He did not lose consciousness. He wished he had. Instead, he lay trapped under sandbags and splintered duckboards, tasting earth and blood, unable to move anything except his left hand. Voices called out in the darkness above him, other soldiers digging through rubble, searching for survivors. He tried to shout but had no breath. His chest was compressed, each inhalation a desperate struggle. Time became strange. He might have been buried for minutes or hours. Later they told him it was 45 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. In that darkness, with death pressing down on him from all sides, Thomas Clarke finally surrendered. Not to the Germans, but to the war itself. He stopped fighting, stopped hoping, simply existed in that dark space, waiting for the end with something approaching relief. They pulled him out eventually, coughing and gasping. Nothing broken, the medic said cheerfully, back to duty within the week. But something had broken, something invisible but fundamental. Thomas Clarke returned to the line, performed his duties, led his men, followed orders. But he was no longer entirely present. Part of him remained buried in that trench, in that moment of absolute surrender. His letters home stopped in November 1917. Margaret wrote asking why he had not responded, her childish handwriting increasingly worried. "Are you angry with me? Did I do something wrong? Please write back. I miss you." Thomas read her letters and felt nothing. The capacity to feel, to care, to maintain connection across the gulf of experience. It was simply gone. He had become what the war needed. A functional automaton, human in shape, but empty of everything that made humanity bearable. The winter of 1917-1918 was brutal. Men froze to death in the trenches. Supply lines broke down. Rations were cut. The Russians made peace with Germany, freeing up German divisions to transfer west for a final offensive. Rumors spread through the ranks. The Germans would attack in spring, would try to win before the Americans arrived in force, would throw everything into one last gamble. Thomas listened to these rumors with detachment. What difference did it make? Attack, defend, attack again. It was all the same, an endless cycle that had long since lost any connection to the political objectives that supposedly justified it. Men around him talked about home, about what they would do after the war. Thomas said nothing. He no longer believed in after the war. There was only the war, eternal and unchanging. In March 1918, the German spring offensive crashed into the British lines with devastating force. Thomas's unit was in the path of the onslaught. They fought, retreated, fought again, retreated further. The static war of trenches became mobile again, a chaotic swirl of advances and withdrawals. Thomas performed his duties automatically, moving men into position, coordinating fire, executing orders. On March 24th, during a desperate rearguard action near Albert, a shell fragment caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. The pain was distant, unimportant. A medic appeared, pressed a dressing against the wound, injected morphine. "You're going home, mate," the medic said, grinning. "This is your ticket out." Thomas looked at him and felt nothing. Home. The word had no meaning anymore. Thomas Clarke arrived back in Manchester on April 15, 1918, wearing a uniform that hung loose on his frame and carrying a small kit bag that contained everything he owned. The city looked exactly as he remembered, and completely alien at the same time. Electric trams ran on schedule. Shop windows displayed goods. People walked streets that had no shell holes, slept in houses with intact roofs, lived lives uninterrupted by artillery barrages. He stood at Victoria Station, watching the crowds, and felt like a ghost visiting from another dimension. No one looked at him twice. The city was full of wounded soldiers by that point. One more damaged man barely rated a glance. He took a tram to the neighborhood of his childhood, watching familiar streets scroll past, feeling nothing. The terraced house looked smaller than he remembered. His mother opened the door before he could knock, and Thomas saw his own transformation reflected in her eyes. The woman who had wept into her apron in 1914 was now gray and worn, with lines around her eyes that had not been there 4 years ago. "Tommy," she whispered, and pulled him into an embrace that he could not quite return. His father appeared in the doorway, older and bent, reaching out to shake hands and then pulling Thomas into a hug instead. "You're home," his father said, his voice breaking. "Thank God you're home." Over their shoulders, Thomas saw her. Margaret was not 8 anymore. She was 12, on the edge of adolescence, taller and more serious than the child he had left behind. She stood in the hallway, staring at him with enormous eyes. "Did you bring my button?" she asked, her voice small. The question broke something in Thomas, some final barrier he had been maintaining. He looked at this girl, his sister, who had spent 4 years waiting for a promise he had made so casually, so confident in his return. 4 years of her childhood, spent waiting for a brother who had effectively died in France, even if his body had walked home. He had not brought her a button. He had not thought about her request in years. He had failed her in ways large and small, had become someone who could not fulfill even the simplest promises. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said, using her childhood nickname. "I forgot." She nodded slowly, and Thomas saw that she understood. Understood that he had forgotten more than just a button. That he had forgotten how to be her brother. Forgotten how to be human. The army discharged him in May 1918 with a small pension and a medal he did not remember earning. The war continued without him. In July, the Allies began pushing back. In August, the German army started its final retreat. In November, armistice. The war that would end by Christmas 1914 finally ended in November 1918, 4 years and 3 months after Thomas had enlisted. By then, he was working at his father's mill, operating machinery with mechanical precision, going through the motions of civilian life while feeling nothing. When news of the armistice reached Manchester, people danced in the streets. Bells rang, strangers embraced. Thomas heard the celebration from his post at the mill and felt only a distant sadness for the men who had not survived to see this day. Lieutenant Hartwell, Private Whitmore, Edwards who drowned in mud, Thompson who talked to his dead mother. Thousands of names and faces, ghosts that followed him through every day. The years passed. The roaring 20s came and went, but not for Thomas. He existed in a gray space, functioning but not living. He never married. How could he, when he could barely connect with his own family? He never spoke about the war, except in terse responses to direct questions. The nightmares were constant. Every night a return to the trenches, to the mud, to that moment buried alive. He would wake gasping, covered in sweat, and lie in the darkness waiting for dawn. His parents died, his father in 1929, his mother in 1935. Margaret married, had children, built a life. She tried to maintain connection with her brother, inviting him to family dinners, to her children's birthdays. Thomas came sometimes, sat quietly in the corner and left early. He was there but not present, a permanent ghost at his own life. The Second World War came, and Thomas was too old to serve, which was perhaps mercy. He watched the next generation march off to their own promises of quick victory, and he said nothing. What could he say that they would understand? They had to learn their own lessons, pay their own costs. The war ended in 1945, and still Thomas continued his gray existence. He retired from the mill in 1959, spent his days walking the streets of Manchester, watching the city rebuild and modernize around him. The world changed. Man went to the moon, computers revolutionized industry, the Cold War waxed and waned. Thomas Clarke watched it all with the detachment of someone who had stopped being truly alive in 1917. Margaret visited him regularly, bringing her grandchildren, trying to bridge the gap that war had created. She was an old woman now, white-haired and frail, but still his little sister. In the summer of 1987, she came to his small flat with her great-granddaughter, Emma, a bright-eyed girl of 8, the same age Margaret had been when Thomas left. Emma stared at the ancient man in the chair, taking in his shabby cardigan, his worn slippers, the faded photographs on the mantel. "Are you really my great-great-uncle?" she asked. Thomas nodded. Emma hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket. "Great-grandmother said you made her a promise once. She said you forgot because the war was too hard. She said it's okay that you forgot, but I wanted to give you this." She held out her hand. In her palm lay a button, brass and tarnished, with the Imperial German eagle stamped on it. "I got it at a museum shop," Emma said, "so you can give it to her now. Better late than never, right?" Thomas Clarke, 92 years old and 73 years removed from the morning he had boarded a train to war, took the button with shaking hands. He looked at Margaret, and for the first time in 7 decades, he felt something crack in his chest. She was crying. This old woman who had been a child when he left, who had waited a lifetime for a promise fulfilled. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Maggie." She took his hand, the hand that had held rifles and written letters and clung to life through 4 years of hell. "I know," she said. "I know, Tommy. You came back. That's what mattered. You came back." But they both knew the truth. The boy who had promised her a button had never come back. That boy had died somewhere in Belgium, buried in mud and cordite and broken promises. What returned was just a shell, animated by habit, existing but not living. Thomas Clarke died 3 months later, in October 1987, 73 years to the day after he had first entered the trenches near Ypres. At his funeral, Margaret placed the brass button in his hand before they closed the casket. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "Just took a little longer than expected." They buried him in a Manchester cemetery, under a simple stone that listed his name, his dates, and his service. The stone did not say that he had died in 1917 and spent 70 years as a ghost. It did not say that the war that promised to end by Christmas had taken not just his youth, but his entire life. It did not say that sometimes, the cruelest casualties are those who survive, and somewhere, filed in the Imperial War Museum archives, there remains a letter written by a 19-year-old boy named Thomas Clarke in October 1914, promising his 8-year-old sister that he would be home by Christmas with a button from a German uniform. The letter is yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the promise remains, preserved forever, a monument to hope and its destruction. They said the war would end quickly. For Thomas Clarke, it lasted a lifetime, and then some. The guns fell silent in 1918, but for him, the war never truly ended. It simply found new ways to kill, slowly and invisibly, one empty year at a time. If this story moved you, if you felt Thomas's pain and Margaret's loss, please share it. Leave a comment about how war's promises have affected your family's story. Subscribe to hear more stories of those whose sacrifices echo through generations, whose wars never truly ended. Remember them, honor them, and question always those who promise that wars will end quickly.